Laura, whenever you want.
Okay. So thank you all for joining us and welcome to the first webinar organized by Science for Democracy. We will go on for 90 minutes, trying to do our best to allocate enough time for questions in the last part of the webinar. Questions can be written in the chat you have on your screen. Please keep them short, to the point identifying the person to whom you would like to ask them. Let me briefly introduce to you the Luca Coscioni Association and Science for Democracy. The association was founded in 2002 by Dr. Luca Coscioni, who was affected by amyotrophic lateral sclerosis and who passed away in 2006, to protect and promote freedom of research and the right to fully enjoy the benefits of scientific progress. Over the last years, it has been active in Italy as well as internationally, organizing events at the European Parliament and the United Nations, as well as 6 sessions of the World Congress of Freedom of Scientific Research. The 5th meeting of the Congress was entitled Science for Democracy, and since 2018, Science for Democracy has become a platform to promote the right to science and the dialogue between the scientific community and decision makers. Our work includes activities of advocacy, promotion, and monitoring the right to science worldwide. Thanks to the expertise of our members, some of whom will be speaking today, we collect country-specific data to complete the Research and Self-Determination Index. This is an important tool to monitor how the rights of self-determination of scientists and citizens is promoted worldwide, and to contribute to an evidence-based dialogue among policymakers, scientists, patients, and society on how to better realize fundamental human rights. The last meeting of the World Congress, that was held at the Commission of the African Union at the end of February, was dedicated to the right to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications. Its final declaration represents an important step for the present and future of our activities. We are committed to acting to foster effective changes. Our initiatives are directed to creating proposals with a concrete impact, and this approach defines the core of what we are and what we believe in. For instance, this morning, the Petition Committee of the European Parliament discussed our petition on COVID-19 to push for a fast, efficient, and common action to face the current and future crisis. I'm happy to report that the member of the European Parliament decided to keep the issue open to further discussion. I now give the floor to Giulia Perrone, who will introduce the speakers of today's webinar.
Thank you, Laura, and welcome to you all again to this webinar. I'm happy to say that almost 300 people registered for this webinar, so I'm grateful for that. Let me first of all acknowledge the participation of the Human Development and Capabilities Association in the webinar. Thank you all for joining us today, and thanks to our co-founder, Claudia Basta, for involving the association. So today we will talk about the human right to science, also in light of the recently adopted General Comment number 25 on science and economic, social, and cultural rights. A first draft of the comment was published by the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in January, and it was when the committee called on governments and civil society and stakeholders to actively contribute and actively participate in the drafting process of the comment by sending written contributions and written suggestions. So we, as Associazione Luca Coscioni Association and Science for Democracy, we contributed with a few comments, and I'm glad to say that some of our suggestions have been accepted and also integrated into the latest version of the comment that you can find on the website of the committee. So let me introduce the speakers today. The first speaker is Andrea Boggiu. He is a professor of legal studies at the Bryant University. He is co-founder of Science for Democracy, and he will introduce and share the conversation. Then we are glad to hear on the general comment from one of the co-reporters of the document. He is Michiel Mancisidor, and we can say he is the champion of the document. He is a visiting professor at the University of Deusto, and he's also a UN Treaty Body expert at the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. We are delighted to hear from two representatives from UNESCO about their contribution to the interpretation of the right to science. And they are April Tash and Konstantinos Tararas, both program specialists at the social and human sciences sector of UNESCO. Then it will be the turn of Jessica Wyndham. She is director of the Scientific Responsibility, Human Rights and Law program of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She will help us understand what's next now that we have a general comment on science, and she has been one of our key partners since the very beginning. So thank you very much, Jessica, and welcome here. And last but certainly not least, Professor Cesare Romano. He is a professor of law at the Loyola Law School in Los Angeles, and he's also co-founder of Science for Democracy. And he will address some of the necessary decisions and actions that should be taken now that we have a general comment on science. Finally, our coordinators, Marco Perduca and Marco Cappato, they promoted all this and they will make their final remarks. So I think we are now ready to start, and I hope you will enjoy the webinar. So Andrea, the floor is yours. Thank you.
All right, thanks Laura and Julia for introducing the webinar. My name is Andrea Boggio, and I'm a legal scholar and part of the steering committee of Science for Democracy. I will chair the webinar, and so my job is primarily to ensure that we move forward at the right pace. So for the speakers, maybe I'll give you 2 minutes, 1 minute, and just to keep things moving. The webinar is an opportunity to celebrate, as Julia suggested, the adoption of the general comment number 25, but it's also an opportunity to reflect on how we got here and what's ahead of us. To this end, we have a representative from UN bodies working on this issue, from the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights and UNESCO, but also from the world's largest scientific society, the AAAS, which with its 120,000 members has been really a champion in stimulating and promoting our thinking on the relationship between science and human rights. Just a few years ago, in 2015, international legal scholar William Chavez noted that the right codified in Article 15 of the Covenant had remained very much a sleeping beauty. Well, today I think we can say that this is no longer true. The general comment has woken up the sleeping beauty. It's an occasion to celebrate that. Scholars and advocates interested in science and human rights. The awakening process hasn't happened overnight. The first sign of life came in 2009 when, under the auspices of UNESCO, a group of experts met in Venice and issued a statement which has been essential to triggering the conversation on the right to science. Soon after, we had the appointment of a special expert in the field of cultural rights, Ms. Farida Shahid, who then became also a special rapporteur up until 2015, when the baton was passed to Ms. Karima Benoune, who is a special rapporteur in the fields of cultural rights. Now, during these years, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights also began discussing the need to adopt a general comment and selected Professor Manchisider as the special rapporteur for this general comment. Professor Manchisider was later joined by another member of the committee, Rodrigo Primi, in this task. The first draft was made available to the public in 2018, and in October we held a day of general discussion in Geneva, and all the speakers who are talking today were there. So it's an opportunity also to rejoin after a year and a half and look backward and forward. And then in January, as Julia suggested, it was adopted after it was made public again for public comment, and then adopted in at the last session of the committee. UNESCO has also taken initiatives in this area. I just want to mention two. One is the updated recommendation on science and scientific researches 2017, and currently is working on developing our recommendation on open science, which are themes clearly connect with the issue at hand today. So as you can see, much work has been done in this field and much more lies ahead of us. Today, our focus is on General Comment 25, which adoption, I would argue, is a milestone achievement and opens doors to new possibilities for science advocates. Without further ado, I will leave the floor to the person who has carried out this vision and has been essential to the drafting and adoption of the general comment. I thank Mikel for being here and also for having contributed in the past to our work. I think it's been a mutually beneficial relationship. And so I will leave the floor to Mikel Manchester, whose topic is the general comment. Mikel, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. No, it's me who has to thank you, Andrea, for everything. So good afternoon, everyone. It was only 2 months ago that I was invited also by Science for Democracy and by Luca Coccioni Associazione to deliver a short speech on the human right to science at the World Congress for Freedom of Scientific Research in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, in the 25th of February. Some of you were there, so you'll remember quite well. It was exactly 9 weeks ago, and still so many things have happened to all of us that it seems a long time ago. Many of us, we are at our home, confined. Thousands of people have died, and the world economy has, to say the very, very, very least, suffered. In the middle of this horrible situation, we can find a lesson to learn. We can find a terrible, teachable moment, an opportunity to understand our complex world, our societies, and even to understand ourselves a bit better. We also have here an opportunity to reflect on and to learn about the role of science in world affairs, the role of science in any democratic society, the relation between science and transparency, the relation between science and participation, the relation between science and human rights. In a few words, we face an opportunity to revisit what many of us call the human right to science. First, I want to thank again Science for Democracy and Luca Coccioni Associazione for having invited me to this extremely important webinar on the right to science. Last month, on March the 9th, the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which I'm a member, adopted its General Comment number 25 on science and economic, social and cultural rights, known by many in an informal way as the General Comment on the human right to science. What is this General Comment about? What is the human right to science? These are the questions I'd like to present to you today. I've been given, if I'm right, from 10 to 15 minutes. This is right, Andrea. And in order to make the most of it, I plan to organize my presentation in 3 parts. First, what is a general comment? Second, some ideas about the normative content of the human right to science, and finally, a very short reflection on why all this matters now in the middle of the coronavirus crisis. First, science was included in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Article 27. I quote, "Everyone has the right freely to participate in the cultural life of the community, to enjoy the arts, and to share in scientific advancements and its benefits." After the declaration, the UN approved 2 covenants, one on civil and political rights and the other one on economic, social and cultural rights. Scientific issues were included in the covenant on economic, social and cultural rights, again, as it was the case in the Universal Declaration, in the article devoted to cultural rights. Article 15 states that the states party to the present covenant recognize the right of everyone to enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications. And then it adds some additional normative content, such as the duty to conservation, development, and diffusion of science, the respect of the freedom of scientific research, and the recognition of the benefits of the international contacts and cooperation in the scientific field. The Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, that is the supervisor of this covenant, decided a few years ago to update this right by means of a general comment that, as it has been said, was adopted a few weeks ago, and it's already available at the UN website and has been provided by the organizer of this webinar on their site. But what is a general comment? The general comment is the authoritative interpretation made by a United Nations committee of the meaning and the content of a human right included in a treaty. That means that the committee explains to the states what their obligations are according to the treaty. A general comment cannot create a new obligation for a state, but can and should remind the states in an up-to-date manner what it committed to do in a binding or compulsory manner on the day it ratified the covenant. That's why the general comment is so powerful, because it's an authoritative interpretation for all 170 states currently party to the treaty. This general comment would, in this way, assist the states parties in the implementation of the rights related to science, and also provide guidance to the United Nations, human rights or scientific organizations, university and scientists, as well as civil society as a whole, including corporations, to have a better understanding of their rights and obligations in relation to science.
Mikhail, sorry, we lost your camera.
Do you hear me?
We hear you, but we cannot see you.
And let's try now. Now?
Wonderful, thanks.
Okay, can I follow? Second point. What is this right about? The general comment has almost 100 substantive paragraphs that I'm not able to summarize here in 10 minutes, but I try to share with you some key ideas. I selected these few ideas with the coronavirus crisis in mind. First idea about the content. The right is enshrined in the treaty in terms of benefits of science. So what does benefits mean? The term benefits refer here first to the material results of scientific research, such as medicines, vaccination, technological instruments, or so on. Secondly, benefits refers to the scientific knowledge and information directly deriving from scientific activity, because science provides benefits not only because of its material results, but also through the development and dissemination of the knowledge itself. Third, benefits also refers to science's role in forming critical and responsible citizens who are able to participate fully in a democratic society. And finally, science also benefits us by providing knowledge in order to have an evidence-based decision-making process in a democratic society. This is crystal clear in the middle of this coronavirus crisis. Benefits of science are not just about obtaining vaccination or having access to the best treatment available, but also about people having access to knowledge in order to freely participate in a responsible manner. Second idea on the content. We are not interested in an approach according to which only scientists would have a right to participate in science, and on the other hand, the general population would only have the right to enjoy in a passive manner the benefits of science. Science does not only concern scientific professionals, but also includes citizen science. That means ordinary people doing science, and also includes the dissemination of scientific knowledge. State parties must facilitate citizen participation in scientific activities. Again, this is also clear during this present coronavirus pandemic. People are taking part in a global challenge by providing data, by designing and making new devices, for example, for ventilators on their 3D printers, or trying to help in a very wide range of ways. Science also requires a strong protection of freedom indispensable for scientific research. Here we have a third idea on the content. This freedom included the protection of researchers from unjustified interventions, the possibility to express freely and openly on the ethical, social, or ecological value of their projects, the possibility of researchers cooperating with other researchers nationally and internationally, and the sharing of scientific data between researchers, with policymakers, and with the public wherever possible. Again, in this coronavirus crisis, we can see the key significance of freedoms, transparency, and cooperation when it comes to any scientific challenge. Last prioritized idea is on the duty to cooperate internationally. The states should take all measures necessary to enable scientific researchers to participate in the international community, especially through facilitating their travel in and out of their territory. Also, developed states should contribute to the development of science and technology in developing countries. Benefits should be shared with the international community. In addition, international cooperation is essential because the most important risks related to science and technology, such as climate change, dangerous technology, weapons of mass destruction, pandemics, needs states to promote multilateral agreements. And there is also in the general comment a specific paragraph on pandemics that obviously it's compulsory to quote here. Pandemics are a crucial example of the need for international scientific cooperation to face transnational threats. If adequate measures are not taken, a local epidemic can become very quickly a pandemic with devastating consequences. The World Health Organization's role in this field remains fundamental and should be supported. Combating pandemics effectively requires stronger commitments to scientific international cooperation. International cooperation should improve early warning mechanisms based on timely and transparent information that would allow early interventions based on the best scientific evidence. Finally, after the pandemic, scientific research should be promoted to learn lessons and increase preparedness in the future. Many more issues are included in this general comment, but because of the limitation of time, I stop here, invited you to have a closer look at it. But in order to sum up, the general comment presents a right to benefit in a broad sense, a right to access and to participate, a right to foster the conservation, development, and diffusion of science, a right which implies freedoms, a right with a strong international cooperation component. And that will bring us to the end, to the next and last point. I'll do it quickly because I know there is another participant that is going to go more in depth on this issue. The general comment cannot be understood as the end of any process, but an extremely important turning point. We have a new and powerful legal instrument for the promotion of science in the service of humanity and in the service of those in need. But it will be a useful tool only if it is known and used by all of us. The approval of this general comment marks, in this sense, a new starting point, and I invite all of you to take part in it. And being this webinar an opportunity to do so, I finish expressing my appreciation to the organizers for the opportunity given. Thank you. And I think, dear Andrea, this way I kept on the time limit given, didn't I?
Yeah, well, I respected your authority as a member of the committee. Allowed you to speak a few more minutes, which is great. Thank you for your comments. That was interesting. So now the floor goes to the two representatives of UNESCO. They're both program specialists, April Tash and Constantinos Tararas. I think Constantino is going to go first, and the topic is UNESCO and the right to science, past milestones and future perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, let me first of all thank the association for inviting UNESCO to contribute to this webinar. This is the second instance this year that our paths are crossing, and I hope that we will have many opportunities to work together in the future. Let me, before starting with my presentation, also congratulate Miquel, because he has been a torchbearer of the right to science for many years, but also share the credit with Rodrigo Primi, his co-rapporteur, but also the members of the committee, for really adopting something that in 2009, and Jessica will confirm that, seemed really impossible, to have a general comment on science and economic, social and cultural rights, or the right to science. Last but not least, I'm very happy to be friends, because we have shared this effort for many years, and I'm talking about me and Jessica in particular, and Andrea more recently, and so it's a very friendly environment to find ourselves. Now, in terms of my presentation and that of my colleague, we will touch upon 3 issues. The first one is the mandate of the organization, so as to explain why UNESCO and the right to science. Secondly, present a bit the evolution of UNESCO's approach, but also the approach of its member states and the member states of the United Nations system vis-a-vis science and human rights. And I think it connects very well with the way Miquel presented the right to science, and finally close with some future perspectives and priorities. So the mandates. As you know, probably UNESCO is the only UN entity with such a broad mandate in the field of science. But what is more important to note is actually the function, the source of it, namely the vision of an inextricable connection between peace and the realization of human rights. With international cooperation in the field of science, education and science and culture being really the pathway, the bridge that connects the realization of human rights with the consolidation of lasting peace. UNESCO promotes all human rights, but it has a focus on the rights that are directly connected to its mandate, and the right to science is among them. Now, I was talking about a shift, a change in the approach of the organization. Obviously, the way we were dealing with the science and human rights has not been static, but has changed significantly over the years. Perhaps we can cluster that evolution into 3 major phases. The first one was immediately after the adoption of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And there we see in the approach of member states a focus on 3 aspects of science. The first one is the optimal use of science and scientific methods for the benefit of humankind. The second aspect is more about addressing the dangers of scientific research, particularly in the era of developing weapons of mass destruction, but also scientific developments that may give rise to other ethical or legal issues. And the final aspect that is highlighted is the issue of international cooperation and its importance in sharing the benefits of humankind for all nations across the world. Those 3 aspects, we find them central in the predecessor, the first recommendation of UNESCO on science, on the status of scientific researchers, adopted in 1974, and in a concurrent recommendation on human rights education, adopted likewise by UNESCO General Conference in 1974. But also we find that that emphasis in international instruments adopted by the UN at the time, notably the Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States, and the Declaration on the Use of Scientific and Technological Progress in the Interest of Peace and the Benefit of Mankind. The second period, the second phase in UNESCO's approach is marked by a focus on ethics by ethics, and looking again and focusing on the standard setting activity of the organization. First milestone is the adoption of the Universal Declaration on the Human Genome and Human Rights in 1997, where there we have a focus on particularly the potential abuse of science and scientific research. We have an appeal to scientists and a call for their special responsibilities in doing science. We have an emphasis in the promotion of international dissemination of knowledge. But the idea of benefit sharing comes to the forefront with a later declaration of 2003 on human genetic data, where we're talking about the sharing of the benefits of science, including medical care, with society as a whole. However, the turning point and the presence of this benefit sharing issue at the center stage of standard setting in UNESCO comes with the 2005 Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights, which basically adds to the idea of benefit sharing the issue of access to scientific and technological knowledge, which is a very interesting addition to the debate that was going on until then. But the declaration goes less into the whole issue of advancement of science or the freedom to conduct science. Here, I think it's interesting to note an opinion that is not, unfortunately, very well known of the International Bioethics Committee, which is an expert body created to monitor and follow up the implementation of this declaration, which tried to enlarge a bit the scope of how we understand benefit sharing. And there they put the emphasis on sharing, meaning also participation. And so going beyond the top-down beneficence, including also open access to information. And here we move to the last phase of UNESCO's approach, where we basically have two instruments that have really marked the transition to a broadening scope of understanding of science. The first one was the Declaration of Ethical Principles in relation to climate change in 2017. It emphasizes the fundamental importance of science for sustainable development. It refers to issues as the prevention of harm, international cooperation, the precautionary principle. But I think what is really important to keep from that instrument is the provisions on scientific knowledge and the integrity in decision making, and the connection that is established with between science, scientific evidence, and policy making. However, really the turning point in terms of establishing, articulating in a very convincing manner a broad holistic approach to science as a process and anchoring it in human rights was the 2017 recommendation on science and scientific researchers, for which I will give the floor to my colleague April to share more about the features of the recommendation, also present some of the priorities for us in the years to come, and then I will close with some final results. April?
Thank you, Kostas. It's hard in a webinar to cut to the chase and to deal with all the issues of content that we've already touched on. I did want to express the joy that we had internally to the staff when we saw the outcome of all the work that went into the general comment, because it's an achievement and very difficult to get. We were impressed with the work. So I'm congratulating a colleague, but I think he really deserves the congratulations. And we can all celebrate, really celebrate the outcome of these efforts, because now we can see there's an uptick in interest in this consensus building that has been going into all of these instruments over the years that Kostas has just described. And the last one that UNESCO had worked on was in 2017, and we really appreciate that now we can see that the human rights in the area to do with science are clarified in a way that we can work with more consistently. What we have to do now with this place that we're at now and the consensus that has been built by the countries in their negotiated works is really to think about what does this new vocabulary give us. And I think that we have tried in the last years, because our work is slightly different, not focused only on human rights, but on science systems as a whole, we have tried to look at the entire system and look at all the different aspects of human rights. And I think that that was the general comment, took that approach too, to consider science as a whole and all the aspects of human rights that could be problematic or tricky or how they interact. So I think the systems approach is interesting. This duty of international cooperation in science is also very interesting to us because we've seen it for a long time. But the context of science has changed since the Universal Declaration and the Covenant were written. We know that that's true from these consultative efforts and all the letters and exchanges that we've had. So we see in the context of science all of these changes, and we think that the instrument that we worked on called the Recommendation on Science and Scientific Researchers is really geared to the very subtle aspects of how do you build the context for science to be carried out in a way that will deliver on human rights in society for everyone, including the participative science that you described as citizen science. And we also thought of in terms of bringing science back into the schooling of young children, because that's how UNESCO has always thought about making change. You start with the youngest children. So if you look at the coherence that we now see is there between the work that we've done on science systems and the work that you have really made an achievement with in the terms of the human rights system and our clarification of these obligations, I think that we have a moment where the next natural step is to think about how are the countries going to actually show that they are achieving these goals. We know that in our system, we have now an agreement by the countries themselves since 2017 to do a 4-yearly checkup of their science systems. And we're trying to move in a direction where we would harmonize all of the statistics collection that relates to science systems. So in the past, we called these R&D statistics or S&T statistics or innovation statistics. We had separate techniques and surveys that were used in multiple countries. We are trying to go in the direction of, slowly trying to go in the direction of bringing these together. And the first round is this year. So this year, we're asking countries to rethink their national statistics to incorporate issues like the right to science. That would mean that instead of looking at it, at the measurement of science in terms of how many patents and publications come out of your science system and how many graduates and PhDs go into it and how much funding there is, you would also ask the question, is there autonomy? Is there a real scientific freedom? Is there openness? Is the system functioning to bring science into the communities as well as bring people who otherwise hadn't participated in science into scientific careers? All of these things. What we use is a tool called the 10 key areas of the recommendation on science. We know that we're now going to be using the general comment because now it's there. So we have a very strong and coherent basis for the work ahead this year. And we know that the states are being asked to give their first reports on the 31st of March next year, 2021. We really hope to get every country to participate. And as a last comment, I think I can stop early and maybe hand it back to Kostas to mention the SDGs. But as a last comment, I just wanted to congratulate the AAAS because although I went to your annual meeting this year and I realized that AAAS may have forgotten about these issues at the international level, I have to tell you, I went into the archives and I learned that many years ago, AAAS was advocating for scientific freedom, scientific responsibility, and they brought to UNESCO the task of putting together the first recommendation on the status of scientific researchers, which ended in 2017 with this more general framework for all science systems. So in fact, this is really to congratulate both the work that's been done on the general comment and to congratulate the AAAS for having advocated it for so many years and now basically getting what it wanted. I give it back to Kostas for a moment because there's a few more words to say about how this fits with SDGs.
Thank you, April. Building on what you said about the monitoring of the recommendation, I think a broader task that we have precisely because of the large scope of science that we have put on the table is addressing the different conceptual issues that are included with concepts like open science, where, for example, we launched a new standard setting process in UNESCO earlier this year, require that there's a lot of investment and a lot of conceptual work that needs to be done. Another area is the connection with cultural rights. As you have mentioned, Mikel and Andrea, this right is embedded in the family of cultural rights, and this is still an issue that needs to be clarified and operationalized. Another elephant in the room, if I could call it like that, is the whole issue of really tapping into the potential of the Agenda 2030 and the commitment from member states in that process. We have two important considerations that are favorable. The first one is the fact that there is a recognition in the preamble of the 2030 agenda of the importance of science, technology, and innovation for meeting the goals of the agenda. And of course, the explicit anchoring of the agenda in human rights and the vision of leaving no one behind. However, until now, if you look at the monitoring, very little has been dedicated to an articulation between science and human rights. So that will require reflection, that will require guidance, that would require advocacy until the connection really finds its way into the mechanics of the 2030 agenda. Another issue is the whole uptake of the right to science by human rights mechanisms. Michael has mentioned it from the perspective of the Committee on Social and Cultural Rights, but the absence of the right is really blatant also in the Universal Periodic Review and in other bodies' work where the right to science actually is playing fundamental role in the achievement of many of the entitlements that are contained therein. Likewise, we have to find a way that the actors are aware, that member states parties are aware, and therefore the reports and the discussions really address the right to science in its full importance. And of course, a major role in this respect is the one to be played by the UN system itself. Because we know that, for example, the UN country teams, the presence of the UN system at the country level is key in the way that member states, state parties are filling their reports, providing information at the international level. And of course, it's important to make sure that the right to science finds its way in the operational work that the system is conducting at the country level. So all that will require a tremendous effort. And just to keep with the reference to the fairy tales world that Andrea started by quoting Professor Shebas, I would say that if we admit that the right to science is maybe not the Sleeping Beauty, but the Cinderella of economic, social, and cultural rights, it would require a lot of effort to make sure this appearance at the forefront is not a firework. Thank you very much.
Thank you to both of you for connecting the work of your agency with the rest of the UN, and also for looking at the future, what the agenda may look like. So it's a good time to move to Jessica Winham from the AAAS, where she is the director of the Scientific Responsibility, Human Rights and Law Program. And I met Jessica through the Science and Human Rights Coalition, which is hosted by the AAAS, has done a lot of good work in this area. So Jessica, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Associazione Luca Coscioni for the invitation to participate in this webinar. I greatly appreciate it. And it's an honor to be a part of the discussion with this distinguished panel. I also really want to congratulate Miquel Mancisador for achieving what seemed, as Costas said, impossible for many years, and that is a general comment on the right to science. In 2007, as Andrea mentioned, eminent international lawyer Professor William Schabas described the right to science as being tucked away at the tail end of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and occupying a similarly neglected place in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, a right that he said has received little attention, even taking into account the more general marginalization of economic, social, and cultural rights. It was at that time that I began to turn my attention to the right, to work with colleagues to define an agenda for the scientific community's engagement in the process of defining the right, and to partner with civil society organizations and others around the globe to contribute to the UN process of developing a statement on what the right means in practice. So we fast forward 13 years to 2020, and as we've heard, the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights has adopted a general comment on the meaning of the right to science. And that general comment provides the committee with an authoritative basis for monitoring implementation of the relevant treaty. But it also provides governments with guidance for how to implement their responsibilities. And most importantly, in my mind, it provides a tool for civil society to measure, to monitor, and to advocate for implementation of the right. This important milestone, as several of my fellow panelists have mentioned, has been reached just as the world finds itself in the midst of a pandemic. When across the globe, we're expecting that our leaders will guide us through this public health crisis based on the best available scientific evidence. We're relying on our fellow humans, our neighbors, our family and friends to understand enough about the science to know that they should be staying at home, they should be washing their hands, they should be wearing masks in public. We're learning about the time and processes required to develop a vaccine that's safe for human use. We're cautiously adopting new technological means to trace any contacts we may have had with people carrying the virus and asking the key human rights questions that such tools demand. We're also seeing how certain communities already suffering from poor environmental conditions, lack of access to healthcare, and insufficient resources are being worse hit by this virus. At the same time, many of us are still able to function. We have the technological means to communicate, to hold global webinars such as this one, to stay in contact with our families far away and with our friends across town. There's no better time for us to realize that the right to science is complex. It's highly nuanced, and the right to science is vital to our safe, healthy, dignified, and prosperous existence. For the past 13 years, my work and the focus of my organization and our partners in the AAAS Science and Human Rights Coalition has been concerned with bringing the perspectives of scientists, engineers, and health professionals to the UN process. Colleagues and I have also begun to consider how best to move from conceptualization of the right to its implementation. Engagement of the scientific community in this process brought particular nuance to the meaning of the right, and I want to highlight 3 examples. Mikkel has already mentioned one, which is that the benefits of science include not only those tangible products, treatments, procedures of science, but scientific knowledge and the scientific method. Key here in the scientific community's contribution to thinking about this right was conceptualization of access to the benefits of science, including, for example, that access to scientific knowledge is itself not sufficient. For the general public, access to accurate communication of science and the translation of science in a way that it can be understood by the public is part of what it means to benefit from science. The second contribution is recognition that core to the right is an obligation on governments to design policies and programs based on prevailing scientific evidence. That is, science rather than politics or other inappropriate influences should not drive policy. This obligation is recognized in the general comment as being a core obligation. That is an obligation on all governments, regardless of the financial resources available to them. And third, I want to highlight an acknowledgement that scientific freedom is not absolute, that it must be exercised responsibly. According to a statement of my organization's board of directors, scientific responsibility is the duty to conduct and apply science with integrity, in the interest of humanity, in a spirit of stewardship for the environment, and with respect for human rights. While the language of the right to science only mentions the freedom indispensable for scientific research, that freedom is inextricably linked to scientific responsibilities and must be interpreted as such. So now that we have an authoritative articulation of what the right to science means, we turn to implementation. And implementation is not solely the domain of the UN, of governments, whose primary responsibility it is to meet their obligation, of the treaty monitoring bodies. Implementation requires all like-minded institutions, organizations, and individuals to partner and collaborate, to leverage their knowledge and their networks. We've seen that time and again, when human rights campaigns have been successful, and we should expect the same with regard to the right to science. So to that end, one potential ally in domestic efforts to implement the right is national academies of science, of engineering, and of medicine, as well as young academies. Though national academies don't often consider their work in human rights terms, they do address policy issues that are directly related to human rights. A questionnaire and interviews that we undertook last year revealed that academies recognize human rights as relevant to their work. Several already address civil and political rights issues, not exclusively, but particularly with regard to the human rights of scientists. And 2 initial entry points we identified for collaboration, and they reflect Costas's comments, relate to sustainable development, and April's comments with regard to science education, which is obviously a primary area of focus for academies. The work I've done in collaboration with my colleagues over the past 13 years in bringing the perspectives of scientists to the UN process has required significant bridge building, training, and translation. Scientists and human rights practitioners don't always speak the same language, but that barrier can be overcome, and it can be overcome in a way that draws strengths from the differences of the two communities in working toward a common goal. So let us continue to build partnerships, to forge unlikely connections and find common cause in our commitment to bringing life to the right to science. As I said early on, we currently face a global challenge to stem the tide of the novel coronavirus, to ensure that efforts adopted to fight it maximize public health and human rights at the same time, and to address the immense social inequities that this pandemic has laid bare. The right to science and the recently adopted general comment provide us with tools for doing that. The effort it has taken to get us to the point of having a general comment has been immense, but we cannot rest now. The battle has only just begun, for to achieve implementation of the right to science will require strategic thinking, strategic partnerships, and immense energies. And I look forward to working with my fellow panelists and others in the work ahead.
Thank you very much, Jessica. So now I will leave the floor to Cesare Romano from the Loyola Law School in Los Angeles, who has his own remarks, and I think is going to also pick up the question and answers. And I'll just interrupt you when we get close to the end to give the floor to the two Marcos for some closing remarks. Thank you, Cesare.
Thank you, Andrea. Before I start, I have to say I haven't seen any questions yet. So I don't know, it's because I'm missing something or people haven't asked them. If people haven't asked them, this is a good moment to start shooting them. Okay, I will keep it very short and sweet because the things I have to say are more or less already been said by the previous panelists. But in terms of what we should do now that we have these very detailed authoritative interpretation of Article 15 of the Covenant, and we know what it means that states have an obligation to promote science and to ensure that people benefits from progress in science and technology. The question is that what can we do with that? And as far as I see, there are three things that can be done and should be done. And I'm gonna, like a good professor, gonna give assignments to people. The first one is for the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. You did a great work, but now something else that needs to be done. And specifically is that you need to go back and review the general reporting guidelines for states. This is the instructions that states have to follow when they prepare their reports for their periodic review. And right now, the last edition that you have is the one of March 2019. The right to science is combined with cultural rights because this is what happens in Article 15, right? But because the article is towards the end, the right to science also is in the reporting guidelines at the very end. There are only 3 points in the whole reporting guidelines that deal with science and culture, and they're items 70 to 72. Now that you know the committee and you have told us what the right to science is and it means, it's time to go back and revisit those questions and ask yourself, are they really actually the questions that we want to ask states? And that is first order of things. And then the second, of course, as states prepare those reports, there needs to be an insistence by the committee that states actually do address the question of the right to science. Because more often than not, as things are right now, when states prepare these reports, they talk. If they say anything about science, they say it, but it's very, very briefly, and it's always at the end of the report. The second thing is for the Human Rights Council and possibly some influential states, which is, I believe that we need to have a special rapporteur on the right to science. Within the UN human rights system, within the Human Rights Council, as you know, there are so-called special procedures whereby one particular expert has been assigned to follow either one specific country or one specific theme. As things are right now, there are 44 thematic mandates. That is to say, there are 44 experts, individual or group of experts in charge of following one particular theme. And there are 12 country mandates. All right. Although there is a special rapporteur on cultural rights that has within her mandate also the science, the reality of things is that this is a very broad mandate. And it turns out that in practice, the special rapporteur on cultural rights has very little time left to address also science, right? The last time the special rapporteur on cultural rights said something about science was the report by Farid on the question of intellectual property rights and science. Science is an important enough topic to warrant having its own special rapporteur. And every time I say that, of course, I'm immediately told, but you know, there is a certain fatigue within the United Nations. There are already so many rapporteurs and it costs. Well, let me stop. First, the fact that there are already so many rapporteurs, 56 of them in total, it's not a reason why you shouldn't have a 57th, especially because, and I don't want to make any polemic, some of those 56 who already exist have actually mandates that we should reconsider in light of the current circumstances and the world in which we live. I will not point out to any particular mandate, but anyone who wants and can go and look at the list and make their own opinion. The second one is about the cost. In preparation for this meeting, I've been trying to figure out how much does the United Nations cost one special rapporteur. I have to admit, I wasn't able to find a specific answer because that figure is stuck in deep into the budgets of the United Nations. It also depends how active the rapporteur is, how often this rapporteur is going to travel, how much support he needs, and all of that. But from back of the envelope calculations, I doubt that the special rapporteur to the United Nations is going to cost more than $1 million or maximum $2 million. And this is peanuts for the UN's budget. So if a state wants to pick up this idea and run with it and bring it to the Human Rights Council, that would be a great initiative. And actually, and if last thing is that the question is about who can be the special rapporteur. Well, you just have to look at this webinar. We're definitely not short of talent here. Anyone in this webinar could make a terrific special rapporteur on the right to science. And so there's no excuse for not doing it. And the third thing that needs to be done is for everyone, especially human rights activists and organizations, is that one way in which the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights is going to be able to bring even further the ball on the right to science is if they receive communications, individual petitions claiming violations of the right to science. And this can be done by individuals or can be done by scientists, right? And these cases are brought before the committee, then this will give the opportunity, if the committee find that they are admissible, they have jurisdiction and so on and so forth, to elaborate quote unquote jurisprudence that can even further add to the edifice. But that requires being active, being vigilant, looking around, finding so-called victims to prepare these cases. So together with the Associazione Luca Coscioni a few years ago, we brought the first case ever before the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, raising the question of the right to science. It's SC and PG versus Italy. Eventually, the committee found Italy in violation of the rights of the victims, but of the rights that we invoked, they didn't find the victims in violation of the right to science because they believe that we had not proved the case that these people had actually suffered prejudice of the rights under Article 15. Well, there's only one thing to do now, it's to try again. Find another case, a better case, and bring it. So I love that Mikkel is nodding in agreement with that. But to do that, we need to hear from scientists, and we need to be able to know and find these victims in order to prepare these cases. Okay, so there are several questions now in the meantime that I've been talking. One question is for Mikkel. How will the adoption of the General Convention strengthen how the committee monitors state obligations under the right? So I love these questions because it kind of adds on what I've been saying. I don't know whether we want to guys want to write down the questions and then answer them in rounds, or we just go one by one. Then there is another one. We, the LGBTI people, hadn't the right to any Italian scientific study about our mental, physical, or social health, neither about quarantine, and so on and so forth, risk of suicide, to say the worst indication. I think the question just cut off because there is a, so I'm not sure how the question ends. Sorry, because there's only a limited number of characters that can go into these windows. Okay, Mika, did you get the question? Would you like to answer that? Microphone, you're muted. Can someone unmute him?
Sorry, Chair, who do I need to unmute?
Mikel Maxisidor.
Do you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
So thank you very much. Can face this question, and in relation with some comments already done by other participants, from the more general view to the concrete, to the more concrete ideas. So from the very beginning, or from the more general point of view, we are the committee. We work, we control the states by three main ways. First is the reporting process. Second is the communications system, and third is the providing criteria or guidance via general comment. So we have seen that we have done our job in this third way with this general comment. This is done, so we can focus our job now in the two other ways. So first, as Cesario pointed out it in a very bright way, the communication system is completely open, and I could say that we are not just open but willing to receive good cases based on this human right, because we've already have the how to say the conceptual fundamentals. So we have now the fundamentals that perhaps we hadn't last year. And the most well-known way to monitor or to control the fulfillment of the obligation by the states party to the treaty, this 170 state party to the treaties, through the reporting process. So as all of you know well, every state party of the treaty has the duty, the obligation to present a report every 5 years, more or less. This is a bit flexible, but in principle, it should be more or less 5 years. And in each reporting cycle, the state should inform the committee the extent, the way, the activities, the way the state has improved in the progressive realization of the economic, social, and cultural rights in its territory and for the people under their jurisdiction. And to tell you the truth, the way the states informed till now about the application and the fulfillment of human right to science was a bit disappointing or not enough. But at the same time, we ourselves, as committee, we hadn't tools enough to ask good questions or ask in the correct way, the state way, what we wanted from them. Even the NGOs, the civil society, didn't have enough conceptual tools to organize well the report, their SADU reports, or the comments to the committee. Now we have this conceptual, coherent guidelines in order to control better the state. So from now, and next session is going to be held on September, October, hopefully, if everything goes well with this coronavirus pandemic, and we are allowed to meet and in presential, or I don't know how it's going to work, but in any way, in principle, we'll meet again in September, October, and then we'll have a new 10 or perhaps more like 10, I don't know it by heart, but perhaps 10, 11, 12 countries, and we'll start to ask about this right in a better way. And of course, for sure, the states are not used to this new instrument. They don't know it, so slowly, step by step, they have to learn. All of us will have to learn to use this new tool. We at the committee, in order to make better question to ask in a more intelligent way, the states, in order to present the reports with in a more complex way, not just with slightly how to say, the anecdotic data, but to the point. And also, so civil society, scientists, scientific academia, and all this wide range of organizations that can and should participate in our process. So this is an open and learning process for all of us, and this is wonderful, isn't it?
Yep. Thank you, Mikael. So in the meantime, as you were talking, I was looking at the questions that are popping up in the chat, and there's a lot of things, and they're very diverse. But it seems to me that if one were kind of to synthesize what is kind of cropping up, is that a lot of people are, to say, a bit concerned, if you will, about the clash that we are seeing between politics and science, or culture and science, right? And to what extent does the general comment, but also the work the committee does, or the United Nations does in general, going to be able to resolve these dilemmas that we are seeing cropping around? At the end of the day, someone has to prevail, someone has to have the last word. And who can that be? And can actually the committee say anything useful about that? I don't know who wants to answer these, but
could I say a word?
Sure,
Can
absolutely.
You hear me? Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I have this window. Okay, go.
Your last question, very interesting, but first, just a word to the monitoring. It is a complex system because we have really 3 different places where people can go: the Human Rights Council, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. But there is also a process now within UNESCO because of the fact that what we produced was a recommendation. So these are behind closed doors where they take the petitions. But I would think that the real interest of monitoring now is that now that the general comment is out, so the content is really clarified, we have seen in the general comment the consistency between these instruments allows greater force. So that in whichever, even though the monitoring is complex and in 3 different places, there is a coherence that allows the content to be the same, so that whichever you choose, you're talking about this in the same way. Now, in terms of our instrument, because we go beyond the human rights aspects and we look at the whole systemic aspects, we were interested to know what the general comment would say, because we were taking guesses about how far this is an issue of rights and duties. But only now do we see how well aligned it is and how it really can be defined in terms of rights and duties. And that's when you get to the point of helping people with individual petitions. So now is the time, this is the year to look at this monitoring very closely, and it gives us the right questions to ask. That's why in our monitoring, we're not just talking about the petitions of individuals when we see these cases go wrong, but what questions the country should be asking to include in their reports to the public, let's say, if they were so transparent. What should they tell us about how well they're doing in terms of the international standards exist, but are they offering scientific freedom and scientific responsibility up to those standards? Are they offering the public the right kind of access to scientific knowledge? These questions of monitoring can now be made more specific, and perhaps we'll see next year the first reports coming out with more specific answers. If we were to get to the point where we could press for these answers to be put at the front of the report instead of at the back of the report, it'll be based on asking the right questions. So now we have to get the right questions right. We have to mobilize what we call civil society, but really means any one of us can be part of that. We have to mobilize using the right questions and the right tools and get these answers. I don't think this is a small question. It's been going on for years. The larger question you asked about the place of science in society, I think that's also been part of a process that's been going on for 40 years. We're trying at UNESCO to make sure that science is defended as something independent from government and has its own space to operate as an activity, so that it isn't under the thought control of the needs of the society or government. But we need science to work with the public and the needs of the public, including we need science to consider the immediate demands that some countries have that might put a limit on what can be examined at that moment because of funding, for example. Not, though, to leave out this important question on LGBT. I think the inclusion of people under the agenda of science is a very interesting political question that does have to do with the right to science. And as some have already said in this panel, the right to science has many different aspects and dimensions. And we can't forget about the dimension of discrimination and exclusion. The science that we want to see has to be an inclusive science, a global science, and an effective science that still is science and not fake news.
Excellent. Jessica, do you want to say something?
Sure. I mean, on this question of the politicization of science, as we see greater demand for it in policy making, I would say first, as I mentioned in my comments, and it's reflected in the general comment, it is a core obligation of governments to consider prevailing scientific evidence in their policy making. And for them to be able to do that, they need access to the best science, to the scientific consensus on an issue, and that can be achieved in a variety of ways. It can be achieved through government agencies that include scientists within them, and there are many different models for doing that. But it also requires that scientists are trained in how to communicate their science. It should not be a requirement that all informing policy and decision making, because not all have the training and have the skills, let alone the desire to do so. And hand in hand with that, as April mentioned, is a responsibility in the scientific community to learn how to and to engage in communication of science with the public, and to engage with the public, not only to be speaking at the public. Now, these are all mechanisms or processes that can achieve greater integration of science into policy. They cannot necessarily avoid the politicization of science. And I think scientists walk a fine line sometimes when they're engaging in in policy-making processes. But one thing that should be a guide in how they do that is to stick to the science. And it's generally then for the policymakers to use that science in what we hope is the most honest and transparent way to inform their work. But there is a continuum from just reporting the science in its technical sense to translating the science for a policy audience, for a public audience, and to actually engage in firm advocacy on a particular topic. And that's where the risk of politicization, I think, emerges. And as I said, it's a fine line, and politicization is always a possibility, and finding allies along the political spectrum is one way of helping to avoid that, but I don't think it's totally unavoidable. And to the question by the individual asking about specific access for LGBT communities, I think that's the crux of the question that remains unanswered about the right to science, and it couldn't be answered by the general common, it will be answered over time. And that is, to what is it that people have access in the specifics? Are we talking about access to IVF? Are we talking about access to the internet, which we have seen is a human right? But it's going to be in these very specific questions as they're brought up in domestic contexts that we will learn what it is that we think that all humans need to lead a dignified life. And as a starting point, it is that to which we must all have access under the right to science.
Andrea, of course.
Yeah, I just want to add something about the politicization of science. In many ways, that's unavoidable, and it's welcome because it is a political. And science becomes connected to society, it becomes political, and I think that's necessary to recognize. I think what is important is to distinguish between politicization and partisanship, which is, works well in English. I'm not sure the question came from Brazil, that, science becomes something of a political side, so a weapon for a certain political side to play against the other one. And that's something that hopefully the general comment will help avoid to some extent or diminish the problem with that. There is an interesting question, if I may, Cesare. Another theme that comes out is this tension between cooperation and competition. It's raised, and I think the coronavirus crisis has raised that, transparency, but also now in development of vaccines and drugs. There are some really interesting initiatives on international level, from patent pools to other arrangements. And I wonder if either Michael or our colleagues at UNESCO can say something about whether their instruments deal with the question of cooperation and competition, and whether that's a duty from a legal perspective for the committee, or the issue of responsibility of scientists from the UNESCO perspective. Go ahead,
yes, sure. I would say that the instrument does actually touch upon it. We had a lot of input on that through the consultations, because what we took as a starting point was that it's not the obligations of we were using the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. It's not the obligations of the Human Rights Declaration that would have changed, but it's the science and the context of science. And so as we looked at science, it's so competitive, And there's so much going on in different places that when we updated the instrument and we really tried to apply it, we're looking at the applications in all settings, so public, private, wherever your funding comes from, and whether you're in a garage or citizen science, if it's science, it's covered. So we looked really from a systems perspective as well, and we did have great trouble dealing with that issue of when your responsibilities are right at that knife edge where you're trying to keep quiet about your information because your contract doesn't want you to give away anything before it's patented and before you can make money off of it, or you're competing so hard that you will not share your data. We ended up very much sticking with what scientists themselves through their associations and academies were telling us would be their preference. So we have a lot of language in our instrument about openness and promoting sharing, which we think has been lost a little bit in the last years because of some adjustments made to the intellectual property systems. I say that in an informal webinar. I don't say that because the text will tell you that. The text says we always want the intellectual property regimes to be in place, and that's also a human right, by the way. But it is true that there is a question of balance, and so we introduced the word balance. We introduced the word common, global common science as a common good. So these sorts of things were an attempt to deal with a highly competitive environment that has separated scientists and is actually creating an inefficient overall global system of science. There is too much reproduced without being published, and we're not getting all the information about what research is being done. So we don't even keep track of all the research in the world. We know that this is creating new problems, even in terms of what can be funded, because there's so much waste, you could say, if you wanted an efficient science system. So there's many ways to look at this, but competition versus collaboration was a big part of these 4 years of discussion. And I don't think this has been solved, but we tried to introduce a few points. It's going to be a continuing debate.
Yeah, we have maybe 3 or 4 minutes, and I see more hands. So I'll Konstantinos and then Jessica.
Thank you, Andrea. Just to add to the very valid points that were made by our speakers, I think a first issue that we will need to address as we move into the practice is the difficulty that we find in the specifics. One of the examples is how to translate this balancing that April was talking about between development of science, the sharing of scientific research, methodologies and practices, and intellectual property that, as you said, it's recognized as a human right, and it has been acknowledged as a driver of progress to a large extent. And the cutting edge will be, or the decision making will be, once we get into the specifics. The same applies to one of the questions that one of the participants is sharing about cultural practices and potential clashes with science. There's obviously no general prohibition of cultural practices, because the majority of them are very much in line with broader human rights principles and standards. But of course, there are cultural practices that are violating fundamental human rights, and these are recognized as outside the scope of protection, as many general comments have done. Another issue is the question of this disinfodemic, as we call it now in the UN. And this is something that many agencies have pointed to. UNESCO is working closely together with WHO and basically really highlighting the need for timely, appropriate, accurate information and acknowledging the really negative impact of the spread of fake news, either in terms of leading to stigmatization of specific groups or creating panic with really negative results in terms of addressing the epidemic. Another issue that I think is fundamental, and it has also to do with the past of the right to science, is acknowledging at the same time its interrelatedness with other rights, but at the same time its autonomy. Because it's very eloquent, I think, if we look at the different reactions while we face this coronavirus, is that perhaps with the exception of the statement of the committee with respect to economic, social, and cultural rights and COVID, there are very few other actors that have really highlighted the importance of the right to science and developing effective responses. And so at the same time as we acknowledge that the right to science could be an instrument in really boosting the responsiveness of societies, countries, and different stakeholders, we recognize the magnitude of the challenge in the very limited references to the right while in the middle of the crisis. And a final point to highlight the need for cultural change. Cultural change, both in terms of connecting scientific evidence with policymaking, which is a terrain where there still is much to be achieved by UN agencies, intergovernmental organizations in general, but also key stakeholders, the academic community, scientists, etc. But also cultural change within our own institutions, as Jessica was mentioning in her intervention. Scientists do not always speak the same language as human rights activists. You can imagine that the same type of lack of instrument of common communication can be found inside organizations between different departments, and this is really something that we will have to address if we want to see the right to science finding its way in a horizontal manner in the work of our organizations and entities. Thank you.
Jessica, Mikel, do you have a closing comment?
My comment is a brief one. Picking up on what we've just discussed, as part of the research that we did on the right to science, we conducted interviews with public health practitioners around the world, some of whom were very focused on their domestic context, some of whom worked at an international scale. What was unsurprising to me, though disappointing to have confirmed, was the fact that particularly at the international level, public health and access to medicine campaigners see little value in appealing to a rights framework. And so I think we have to recognize that and think about why that might be as we talk about using the right to science in the context of COVID, in the context of competition, and so on. So I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you. Mikel, I don't know if you have any closing words, otherwise I'll let Marco close. No microphone, Miguel.
Do you hear me? Do you hear me? Okay. Yes, I had some comments to do, but in a very, very, very brief manner. First, the politicization of science was worrying or an interest that it was from the very beginning on the travaux préparatoires of the Declaration of Human Rights from the very beginning. The relation between science and democracy, science and politics, science and international relations, science and war, science and military complex, and so this is a very old question. This instrument, this new general common, is not going to solve it or to resolve it. This is clear, but we have a new interesting tool in order to help us to differentiate this issue. Not more, no less. On the issue on fake news and even pseudoscience, this general comment treat this issue in a very direct manner. There are at least 8, 9, 10 references to pseudosciences and fake news. So we have again instruments in order to ask very, very direct questions to the states. Finally, on your own question on international cooperation, international cooperation is it's part of the duty of the states according to Article 2.1 of this covenant. But in addition, we have a new call specifically devoted to international cooperation on scientific issues. Almost all the states has till now accepted their duty to talk about their the international cooperation in terms of obligation before our committee. In general terms, both on quantity and quality issues. So now they have to also give explanations of their international cooperation, particularly on science issue, both from a quantity and a quality issue. And the very last point, but a very important point that I like, and I want a t-shirt, this t-shirt Marco is wearing. I like it very much. Science is a human right, and I want a t-shirt like this. So next time we can wear one t-shirt like this. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Of course, to everybody. We also have bags and lots of goodies. Thank you, everybody, for this very interesting and thorough discussion. We have some other questions that have been asked. Perhaps we can collect them and circulate later via email. I think I would like to start from what Jessica has said at the very end of her last comment. I think we didn't have a right to science, or at least the notion when you sent out the questionnaire wasn't as consolidated as it is today. So we need to move from Sleeping Beauty to Cinderella to Beauty and the Beast, I guess. So now a lot of relationships should start, and at the end, everybody will live happily ever after, the moment in which things are a little clearer. We're also, with Science for Democracy and the Luca Coscioni Association, working on using, as Cesare was saying before, everything that has come out of the general comment in a, so to speak, political way. Some of the things that Cesare has asked and suggested have been included in a petition that was discussed this morning by the European Parliament. And they have taken upon themselves to include them in a more specific discussion at the Constitutional Affairs Committee, and possibly moving to the floor for a resolution that will start from urgent measures on the coronavirus crisis, suggesting general reforms for the entire European Union. At the same time, if you can go to the website of Science for Democracy, which is sciencefordemocracy.org, you will see an international appeal that we are circulating at the moment that is trying to do the same. It has collected and listed a lot of the suggestions that have been put forward by the scientific community, multinational organizations, as much as foundations and other experts. And it has already been signed by Sir Rich Roberts, who was a Nobel Prize for Medicine, awarded in 1993, that is trying to balance the tendency of, on the one hand, not including science within the decision-making process, but now, thanks to the general comment that there are no more excuses or alibi not to do it, but at the same time to support the work of the United Nations, starting from WHO, then moving to UNESCO, and certainly the UN as a whole. On Monday, we know that the European Commission, for instance, is launching a fundraiser to find $7.5 billion to support WHO. This is certainly a very important first step. A step that for us should need to an entire, if you want, radical reform of the multilateral system. In a moment in which the biggest donor to the United Nations is pulling out or limiting their support for the UN, we need to find alternative sources. Certainly, there's a lot of money now being injected into Europe by European institutions to support also the economic and social aspects of the sanitary crisis. we should not limit it to Europeans. It has to go beyond our borders and reach out to our neighbors in the east and the south and on the other side of the ocean, because they may be more in need than we are today. The other issue that we are now trying to promote is that to make this need, and the need is to establish a more thorough relationship along the lines of the scientific method between science and decision makers, one of the topics for the next UN General Assembly. If they're going to have it, to how and where, that's a different story, but we are adjusting, and this is a good example, today's webinar, of a different way of contacting people and involving them. And I think this is something that we have been working in the past, and we will continue to work in the future, because now that it is clear that all the human rights implications of science, it may be easier, so to speak, for heads of states and heads of government to talk about those issues in a more concrete way. I see that Marco has turned on the camera, so if you want to have the final word, it's up to you, or maybe just say ciao to everybody.
Just to say hello to everybody. Thank you very much, because it was very important. I think it was the first real occasion of reflecting about what happened at the UN, or at least for me it was. I think for the next appointment, we should involve the African Union, because I think that it would be of utmost importance to have from the very beginning the African Union on board on this process, in order to have the complete picture. So not only science, where there are strong structures of scientific research, but also science where we have to foster, we have to enhance cooperation, and we have to enforce, and it is more difficult to enforce the right to enjoy the benefits from scientific progress and its application in Africa, in some areas of the world, of course, also in Europe sometimes, and the Americas, but the alliance with the African Union, together, of course, with the UN, with the UNESCO, also in this monitoring work that the UNESCO is trying to do, I think it would be of tremendous importance. So thank you very much.
So one last thing is that, again, we will circulate the video that is going to be uploaded to our YouTube channel for your further sharing with colleagues and friends and people that are interested in the matter. We will recirculate the appeal, which can already be signed at sciencefordemocracy.org. We're planning to have a webinar a month. The next will be on a specific topic, trying to touch on the major components of the general comment. So thank you once again for your presence. We had over 150 people between this room and Facebook, and we hope next time we're going to be even more. Goodbye from Rome. Ciao.
Thank you. Stay safe, everybody.
And you. Wash your hands.
Bye to everyone. And the t-shirts.
Of course, once they're all, we have a warehouse which is close to our office. Possibly as of next Monday, we can understand how to get into that building and see what we can do. But certainly we have enough for everybody. Ciao.
We love it.
Bye-bye. Nice to see you all. Thank you.
Bye-bye.